Experience the intimate world of Napoleon, the calm before Waterloo where every moment holds the weight of unspoken understanding. In this peaceful journey through time, you'll discover the quiet dignity of people living their daily lives, unaware of how their small gestures reveal the depths of human experience. The candle flame held steady in the still air of the farmhouse study, its light falling across the rough wooden table where Napoleon sat with his correspondence. The wax pooled slowly at the base, creating small rivulets that hardened into translucent streams, while the flame itself remained constant, unwavering, casting the same gentle circle of illumination that had witnessed countless letters written in countless rooms across his empire. The scratching of his quill against paper created the only rhythm in the silence, a soft percussion that seemed to echo the steady beating of his own heart as he formed each careful word. He paused between sentences, his eyes lifting to watch the flame dance in its own stillness. There was something mesmerizing about its constancy, the way it held its shape while seeming to move, the way it transformed wax into light without apparent effort. The letters he wrote were to Josephine, though he knew with absolute certainty that he would never send them. They would remain here, in this simple room, testimonies to conversations that would never take place, declarations that would never reach their intended recipient. Yet still his hand moved across the paper, forming words that carried the weight of 20 years of marriage, of empire, of love that had been both his greatest strength and his most persistent weakness. The candlelight revealed the grain of the wooden table beneath his papers, each line and whorl a testament to the tree it had once been, to seasons of growth and dormancy, to the patient work of hands that had shaped it into this functional surface. His own hands, smaller than those who expected them to be, moved with the precision he had learned in mathematics, in artillery calculations, in the 1,000 small measurements that had built his empire. The ink flowed from his pen in steady streams, creating words that seemed to emerge from some deep place within him, a place he rarely allowed himself to visit in the harsh light of day. The flame continued its steady burning as he wrote of small things, of the way morning light had fallen across their breakfast table at Malmaison, of how her laughter had sounded in the gardens at St. Cloud. These were not the grand declarations of an emperor to his empress, but the quiet observations of a man who had learned to find the infinite in the particular, who understood that history was made not only in the clash of armies, but in the accumulated weight of 10,000 small moments shared between two people who had chosen again and again to remain in each other's orbit. The wax continued to pool and harden, creating small monuments to the passage of time, while his letters grew longer, more detailed, filled with the kind of intimate observation that he had never allowed himself to express when she was near. He wrote of the texture of her skin in morning light, of the way she held her coffee cup, of the particular silence that fell between them when they read together in the evenings. These memories came to him with startling clarity, as if the act of writing had opened some chamber in his mind that had been sealed against the demands of empire, of war, of the 1,000 daily decisions that had shaped his public life. The candlelight played across the pages as he turned them, revealing the careful formation of his letters, the way his handwriting had evolved over the years from the hurried scrawl of a young officer to the more measured script of a man who had learned that words, once committed to paper, carried their own weight in the world. Each sentence he wrote seemed to release something within him, some tension that had been held so long it had become part of his physical being. The gentle light made everything seem softer, more forgiving, as if the harsh edges of memory could be smoothed by the simple act of honest expression. He found himself writing about their first meeting, not the official version that had become part of imperial legend, but the quieter truth of two people recognizing something in each other that neither had expected to find. The candlelight seemed to flicker slightly as he recalled her voice, the particular cadence of her speech that had marked her as different from the other women of the directory, the way she had looked at him not as a general or a future emperor, but as a man who might understand the complexities of her own heart. The flame burned on, steady and sure, while he filled page after page with these careful observations, these small testimonies to a love that had survived separation, divorce, remarriage, exile, and return. The candlelight fell across his face as he worked, revealing the lines that had deepened around his eyes, the slight softening of his jaw, the way his hair had begun to thin at the temples. He was 46 years old, and tomorrow he would face what might be his final battle, but tonight, in the gentle circle of candlelight, he was simply a man writing letters to a woman who had taught him that tenderness was not weakness, that the ability to observe the small beauties of daily life was perhaps the greatest strength a leader could possess. The ink seemed to flow more freely now, as if his hand had found its natural rhythm, the rhythm of truth-telling that came only in the deepest hours of night when the public self had been set aside and something more essential could emerge. He wrote about their walks in the Tuileries gardens, about the way she had arranged flowers in their private apartments, about the sound of her breathing as she slept beside him in the great bed at St. Cloud. These were the moments that had sustained him through the campaigns, through the endless meetings and decisions and ceremonies that had defined his public life. The candle had burned lower now, its flame still steady, but casting a slightly different quality of light, warmer somehow, more intimate. The wax pool at its base had grown larger, creating a small landscape of hardened streams and rivulets that caught the light and threw it back in tiny fragments. He paused in his writing to watch this miniature geography, seeing in it something that reminded him of the maps he would study later, the careful tracery of roads and rivers that would determine tomorrow's fate. But for now there was only this: the gentle burning of the candle, the flow of ink across paper, the strange comfort of words that would never be read by their intended recipient, yet which seemed, in their very existence, to bridge some gap between intention and fulfillment, between the love that had been and the love that might have been if circumstances had been different, if history had taken another path, if two people had been allowed to remain simply two people without the weight of empire pressing down upon their private moments. The scratch of quill on paper continued, rhythmic and soothing, while the flame held its perfect shape in the still air of the study. Outside, he could hear the distant murmur of his soldiers settling into their positions, the soft sounds of men preparing for what dawn might bring. But here, in this circle of light, there was only the steady burning of the candle, the flow of ink across paper, and the strange intimacy of words that would never be read by the woman for whom they were intended, yet which seemed, in their very writing, to bridge the distance between intention and expression, between the man who had conquered Europe and the heart that remained always just beyond his command. The transition from study to the small dining area was marked only by the soft whisper of his footsteps across the worn wooden floors, the candle in his hand casting moving shadows that danced across the rough walls with each step. The flame remained steady despite his movement, its light revealing the simple wooden table where his evening meal waited. the bread and cheese and wine arranged with the kind of unconscious precision that spoke of servants who understood their master's needs without requiring instruction. The candlelight fell across the food with gentle warmth, transforming this modest repast into something that seemed almost sacramental in its simplicity. He set the candle in its holder at the center of the table and took his seat on the simple wooden chair, feeling its solid weight beneath him, the way it had been shaped by countless other bodies, other meals, other moments of solitary contemplation. The bread lay before him, its crust dark and rough, speaking of grain that had grown in fields he might have crossed in his campaigns, of hands that had kneaded and shaped it, of ovens that had transformed flour and water into this most basic of human sustenance. He reached for it with both hands, feeling its weight, its texture, the way it seemed to hold within itself all the patient processes that had brought it to this table. The tearing of the bread created the softest sound, the crust giving way with a whisper that seemed to echo in the quiet room. The interior was pale and soft, still holding traces of warmth from the day's baking, and as he brought it to his mouth, he found himself thinking not of the grand banquets of his imperial years, but of the simple meals of his childhood in Corsica, when bread was precious and every crumb was savored. The taste was clean and honest, without pretension or elaborate seasoning, and he chewed slowly, deliberately, allowing himself to experience fully this most fundamental of human pleasures. The candlelight seemed to deepen the flavors somehow, as if the gentle illumination could enhance not just sight, but all the senses. He found himself noticing things he had forgotten how to notice, the way the bread's texture changed as he chewed, the subtle variations in its flavor that spoke of the particular wheat from which it had been made, the skill of the baker who had judged precisely the moment when the loaves were ready to emerge from the oven. This attention to detail, this capacity for complete presence in the moment, was something he had cultivated in his military career, but rarely allowed himself in the quieter moments of daily life. The cheese was sharp against his tongue, its flavor complex and earthy, speaking of pastures and seasons, of the patient work of aging that had transformed milk into this concentrated essence of the countryside. The candlelight caught the pale surface of the cheese as he cut it, revealing the subtle marbling that spoke of its history, its journey from farm to table. He ate it with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything, savoring not just its taste, but its texture, the way it seemed to dissolve slowly on his tongue, releasing layers of flavor that had been locked within its dense structure. As he ate, his mind wandered to other meals, other tables, the elaborate dinners at Versailles, where every dish had been a performance, every course a statement of power and refinement. But there had been a distance in those meals, a sense that the food itself was secondary to the theater of consumption, the careful choreography of service and conversation that had surrounded every imperial repast. Here, in this simple room with only the candlelight for company, the food could be itself, could offer its own honest pleasures without the burden of symbolism or ceremony. The wine waited in its simple clay cup, dark red in the candlelight, holding within its depths the memory of vineyards and harvests, of grapes that had ripened under the same sun that had witnessed his victories and defeats. He lifted the cup with both hands, feeling its weight, its roughness against his palms, and drank slowly, allowing the wine to fill his mouth before swallowing. It was not the finest vintage from his imperial cellars, but it carried its own honest character, its own story of soil and weather, and the patient work of winemakers who understood that time and care could transform the simplest ingredients into something approaching transcendence. The flame continued its steady burning as he ate, casting the same gentle light that had illuminated his letters, creating an atmosphere of profound peace in this simple room. Each bite was taken with the same careful attention, the same awareness that this might be his last peaceful meal, that tomorrow would bring chaos and noise and the terrible mathematics of battle. But tonight, in the circle of candlelight, there was only the honest pleasure of bread and cheese and wine, the fundamental satisfaction of hunger meeting sustenance, of the body's needs being met with simplicity and grace. He thought of all the hungry soldiers who would sleep tonight on hard ground, their own simple rations consumed by firelight or in darkness, and felt a strange kinship with them that transcended rank and station. Here was the democracy of hunger, the universal need that made all men equal regardless of their titles or achievements. The bread in his mouth had been made from the same grain that would feed his soldiers, the wine pressed from grapes that grew in vineyards visible from their campfires. In this moment of solitary dining, he was connected to them not through command, but through the simple fact of shared humanity. The candlelight revealed the grain of the wooden table more clearly now, as if his sustained attention had somehow enhanced its visibility. He could see the rings that marked the tree's growth, the subtle variations in color that spoke of seasons wet and dry, of years when the tree had flourished, and years when it had merely endured. His fingers traced these patterns absently as he ate, feeling the smooth surface that had been worn by countless meals, countless hands, countless moments of quiet contemplation like this one. He found himself thinking of all the meals he had shared and all the meals he had taken alone, of the grand dinners where politics and strategy had been discussed over elaborate courses, and of simple repasts like this one, where the food itself became a form of meditation, a way of connecting with the most basic rhythms of human existence. The candlelight fell across his hands as he broke another piece of bread, revealing the scars and calluses that spoke of his history, of weapons held and maps drawn and letters written in rooms much like this one, in the quiet hours when the public man gave way to something more private, more essentially human. The wine cup was nearly empty now, its contents having been consumed with the same deliberate attention he had brought to the bread and cheese. The candlelight caught the last drops as he tilted the cup, revealing their dark richness, their promise of the sleep that would come when this meal was finished. He had learned, over the years of campaign and exile, to find sustenance not just in food, but in the act of eating itself, in the ritual of nourishment that connected him to the long chain of human experience, to all the men and women who had sat at simple tables and broken bread, and found, in that breaking, something that transcended mere physical need. The flame had burned lower during his meal, but its light remained steady, constant, creating the same gentle atmosphere that had marked the entire evening. The wax pool had grown larger, its hardened streams creating a small landscape that caught and reflected the candlelight in countless tiny fragments. He watched this miniature geography with the same attention he had brought to his food, seeing in its random patterns something that spoke of larger forces, of the way small actions accumulated over time to create lasting change, the way individual moments of attention and care could build into something approaching wisdom. Outside, the night had settled fully over the farmhouse and the fields beyond, bringing with it the kind of deep quiet that seemed to hold within itself all the accumulated silence of centuries, all the peaceful moments that had been stolen from the rush of history and preserved in the gentle burning of candles, in the simple act of breaking bread alone. Tomorrow would bring its own demands, its own necessities, but tonight there was only this: the steady flame, the honest food, the profound satisfaction of hunger met with grace, of solitude transformed into a kind of communion with the essential rhythms of human existence. The small mirror hung on the rough wall of his private chamber, its surface reflecting the gentle candlelight that had followed him from room to room throughout this long evening of solitary ritual. The glass was old and slightly warped, creating subtle distortions that seemed to soften the harsh realities of age and wear, transforming his reflection into something that wavered between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. The flame burned steadily beside the wash basin, its light falling across the simple wooden furniture that comprised the entirety of his private space. This modest chamber that bore no resemblance to the gilded apartments of his imperial years, yet which seemed, in its very simplicity, to offer a kind of honesty that those grander rooms had never possessed. He began the slow process of removing his shirt, feeling the fabric slide across his skin with a whisper that seemed to echo in the quiet chamber. The candlelight caught the pale surface of his chest as it was revealed, showing the body that had carried him through 25 years of campaigning, through the heat of Egypt and the cold of Russia, through victory and defeat and exile and return. It was not the heroic physique that artists had imagined in their portraits, but something more human, marked by time and use, by the accumulated weight of decisions and consequences that had shaped not only his destiny, but the destiny of Europe itself. The water in the basin was cool against his hands as he cupped it, lifting it to his face with the same deliberate care he had brought to every action this evening. The droplets caught the candlelight as they fell, creating tiny points of brilliance that seemed to hang in the air for a moment before gravity claimed them, sending them back to join their fellows in the still surface of the basin. The water was clean and cold, shocking his skin into full awareness, washing away the dust and fatigue of the day, and leaving him feeling somehow purified, prepared for whatever the morning might bring. His reflection wavered in the old mirror as the candlelight flickered, revealing and concealing the face that had become one of the most recognizable in Europe, yet which seemed, in this private moment, to belong to someone smaller, more vulnerable, more essentially human than the legend that had grown up around it. The lines around his eyes were deeper now, carved by years of squinting into sun and wind, of studying maps by inadequate light, of making the 1,000 small calculations that had built and sustained his empire. His hair, once thick and dark, had begun to thin at the temples, revealing the pale skin beneath, the mortality that no amount of victory could disguise. The wash basin held the water steady as he leaned over it, feeling its coolness rise to meet his face, and in that moment he found himself thinking of all the other mirrors he had looked into, all the other wash basins he had leaned over, in palaces and campaign tents, in grand hotels and simple farmhouses like this one. Each reflection had shown him the same face, yet somehow different, marked by whatever triumph or disaster had most recently shaped his fortunes. Tonight the mirror showed him a man who had lived fully, who had pushed against the boundaries of what was possible and discovered again and again that those boundaries were more flexible than anyone had imagined. The candlelight fell across his shoulders as he straightened, revealing the slight stoop that had begun to develop from years of bending over maps and documents, of carrying the physical weight of command that seemed to accumulate in the body like sediment in a riverbed. His discarded shirt lay crumpled on the wooden chair, a testament to the day that was ending and the night that was beginning, and he found himself thinking of all the other shirts he had removed, all the other evenings when he had performed this same simple ritual of washing and preparation, this quiet transition from the public man to the private self. The mirror continued to hold his reflection as he moved about the chamber, preparing for the few hours of sleep that remained before dawn would call him back to his public role, his imperial responsibilities. The candlelight softened the harsh realities of age and wear, transforming his reflection into something that seemed to exist between memory and possibility, between the young officer who had first looked into a mirror and imagined greatness, and the aging emperor who now saw in that same glass the accumulated weight of all the choices that had brought him to this moment. The water in the basin grew still again after his washing, its surface becoming a perfect mirror that reflected the candlelight in a steady point of brilliance that seemed to anchor the gentle illumination of the room. In that reflection, he could see not only the flame itself, but the entire chamber reduced to its essential elements, simplified into the basic components of human existence, shelter and light, and the quiet satisfaction of solitude. The mirror on the wall continued to hold his image as he moved about his preparations for sleep, and in its wavering surface he could see all the other men he had been, all the other nights he had spent in preparation for battles that would determine the fate of nations, all the other moments when everything had hung in the balance, and he had found the strength to tip it through will or skill or the mysterious grace that sometimes attends those who dare to imagine that the impossible might, after all, be possible. The chamber itself seemed to breathe around him as he continued his evening ritual, its walls holding the warmth of the day, even as the night air began to seep through the small window that looked out onto the darkened countryside. The wooden floorboards creaked softly under his bare feet, a sound that had become familiar over the weeks of his residence here, a gentle percussion that marked his movements from wash basin to mirror to the simple bed that awaited him. The candlelight threw his shadow against the wall in shifting patterns that seemed to dance with each small movement, creating a kind of silent theater that played out the drama of his solitude. He found himself studying his hands in the mirror's reflection, these instruments that had signed treaties and written letters, that had held reins and swords and the hands of dying soldiers on battlefields across Europe. They were smaller than he had always imagined them to be, more delicate than the hands that legend attributed to him. Yet they had shaped the destiny of millions, had drawn the borders that would define nations for generations to come. The candlelight caught the pale scars that marked his knuckles, souvenirs of falls from horses and the rough handling of campaign life, each one a small testament to the physical reality that underlay the grand narrative of his rise and fall. The mirror seemed to hold not just his present reflection, but the ghostly impressions of all the other men who had looked into it before him, farmers and merchants and perhaps other exiles who had found themselves in this simple room, confronting their own mortality in its wavering surface. The glass had witnessed countless private moments like this one, countless evenings when men had stood before it and tried to reconcile the person they saw with the person they believed themselves to be or hoped to become. In its ancient surface, he could almost see the accumulated wisdom of all those other reflections, all those other moments of solitary contemplation. The water in the basin had grown warm from the heat of the candle, its surface occasionally disturbed by the gentle movement of air through the chamber, creating tiny ripples that caught and scattered the light in patterns that seemed to shift and change with each breath he took. The simple act of washing had become a meditation, a way of marking the transition from the day's concerns to the night's rest, from the weight of memory to the possibility of dreams. The coolness of the water against his skin had awakened something in him that felt almost forgotten, a sense of physical presence that the grand abstractions of empire had sometimes obscured. He moved closer to the mirror, studying the face that looked back at him with an expression that seemed to combine curiosity and acceptance, as if he were meeting a stranger who happened to share his features. The candlelight revealed details that daylight often concealed, the fine lines that spoke of laughter as well as worry, the way his mouth had learned to hold itself in repose, neither smiling nor frowning, but simply existing in the neutral territory between hope and resignation. This was the face that would be remembered by history, yet it was also simply the face of a man preparing for sleep, no different in its essential humanity from any other face that had looked into any other mirror at the end of any other day. The chamber held the silence like a cupped hand holds water, carefully and completely, allowing him to exist within it, as if within a protective shell that separated him from the vast complexities of the world beyond these walls. In this silence, he could hear the small sounds that usually went unnoticed, the settling of wood as the building adjusted to the cooling night air, the distant whisper of wind in the trees that surrounded the farmhouse, the gentle hiss of the candle as it consumed its own substance in the service of light. These sounds seemed to weave themselves into a kind of lullaby, a gentle accompaniment to his preparations for sleep that spoke of the eternal rhythms that governed all life, regardless of rank or achievement, or the grand designs that men sometimes imagined they were pursuing. The cool night air drifted through the partially opened window of the farmhouse, carrying with it the mingled scents of trampled grass and wood smoke from the countless fires that dotted the landscape beyond. Napoleon stood at the casement, his hands resting lightly on the worn wooden sill, feeling the gentle current of air move across his face like a whisper from the darkness. The breeze was constant, but never harsh, a steady presence that seemed to connect him to the vast encampment spread across the Belgian countryside, where thousands of his men lay sleeping under the open sky. The scattered campfires flickered like fallen stars across the rolling fields, each one marking a small circle of warmth where soldiers huddled together, sharing stories or simply staring into the flames. The distant glow cast shifting shadows across the landscape, creating patterns of light and darkness that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the night itself. Some fires burned brighter than others, tended by men who could not find sleep, while others had dimmed to mere embers, watched over by sentries whose silhouettes moved occasionally against the orange glow. Voices carried on the evening breeze, fragments of conversation that reached him in waves, rising and falling with the movement of the air. He could hear laughter from one direction, low and comfortable, the sound of men who had shared too many campaigns to count. From another quarter came the soft melody of a harmonica, a simple tune that spoke of home and distant memories, played by fingers that knew the instrument better than they knew the musket they would carry tomorrow. Someone coughed in the distance, a rough sound that was quickly swallowed by the night, and somewhere else a voice rose in song, only to be hushed by companions who preferred the quiet. The darkness seemed alive with this gentle human presence, a tapestry of sound and movement that spoke of an army at rest. These were not the harsh sounds of battle or the sharp commands of drill, but the softer voices of men being simply themselves in the hours when discipline relaxed and humanity emerged. The night air carried their conversations, their sighs, their quiet movements as they shifted in their sleep or added wood to dying fires. It was a sound he had heard in a dozen countries on the eve of countless battles, yet tonight it seemed different, more precious somehow. He found himself listening more carefully than usual, trying to distinguish individual voices from the general murmur that rose from the camp. There was something in the quality of the sound that spoke to him of trust, of men who slept peacefully because they believed in him, because they had followed him across Europe and back again, through victory and defeat, never losing faith in his ability to lead them home. The weight of that trust settled on his shoulders like the night air itself, invisible but unmistakably present. Through the window he could see the faint outline of tents and makeshift shelters, dark shapes against the starlit sky where his soldiers had made their temporary homes. Some had built small lean-tos against wagon wheels. Others had simply wrapped themselves in their coats and chosen a patch of ground that seemed softer than the rest. The lucky ones had found space in barns or outbuildings, but most were content to sleep under the stars, as they had done so many times before. The sight filled him with a complex mixture of emotions that he could not easily name. The evening breeze continued its gentle movement through the window, bringing with it new sounds and scents from the encampment. He caught the aroma of coffee brewing somewhere in the darkness, a luxury that some enterprising soldier had managed to procure, and the smell of bread baking in a field oven. These domestic scents mixed with the earthier odors of horses and leather, of men who had been marching for days and sleeping rough. It was the particular fragrance of an army in the field, familiar and somehow comforting in its very ordinariness. A group of voices rose briefly in harmony, singing something he recognized but could not quite place. A song from the early days of the Republic, perhaps, when everything had seemed possible and the world had stretched before them like an unwritten page. The melody was simple and haunting, carried on the night air with a poignancy that made him close his eyes and simply listen. When the song ended, the silence that followed seemed deeper, more profound, as if the night itself had been listening and was now reflecting on what it had heard. He thought of the men out there in the darkness, each one a story unto himself, each one carrying his own reasons for being here on this Belgian plain. Some were veterans who had been with him since Italy, their faces marked by sun and wind and the passage of years. Others were young recruits who had joined the Eagles only recently, drawn by tales of glory and the promise of adventure. All of them trusted him to lead them well, to make the decisions that would bring them safely through whatever tomorrow might bring. The responsibility of that trust weighed on him as he stood at the window, feeling the night air move across his face and listening to the gentle sounds of his sleeping army. These men had families, wives and children, and parents who waited for their return. They had dreams and fears and hopes that extended far beyond the boundaries of any battlefield. Tomorrow, some of them would not see another sunset, would not have the chance to return to those who loved them. The thought was not new to him, but tonight it seemed to penetrate more deeply than usual. In the distance, a horse whinnied softly, answered by another from across the camp. The sound was peaceful, domestic almost, speaking of animals that were well cared for and content. The cavalry horses were picketed in neat rows, their breathing visible in small clouds in the cool air. They too seemed to sense the quietude of the night, standing patiently with their heads lowered, occasionally shifting their weight or swishing their tails against night insects. The breeze brought him the sound of someone playing cards, the soft slap of pasteboard against wood, and the occasional murmur of voices keeping score. Gambling was technically forbidden, but he had always turned a blind eye to such harmless diversions. Men needed something to occupy their minds in the long hours before battle, some way to pass the time that did not involve dwelling too much on what the morning might bring. The gentle rhythm of the game was soothing, another thread in the tapestry of sound that surrounded him. As he continued to stand at the window, Napoleon found himself thinking not of strategy or tactics, but of the mystery of leadership itself. How had it come to pass that all these men, each one an individual with his own will and desires, had chosen to follow him? What was it that bound them together in this great enterprise, that made them willing to march hundreds of miles and risk their lives at his command? The question had no easy answer, but it seemed particularly acute tonight, as he listened to their voices carrying on the evening air. The night was growing deeper, and gradually the sounds from the camp began to diminish. Conversations grew quieter, fires burned lower, and one by one the voices faded into sleep. The breeze continued its gentle movement through the window, now carrying more silence than sound, punctuated only by the occasional snort of a horse or the distant call of a sentry. Soon, he knew, the entire army would be asleep, trusting in his vigilance, believing that he would watch over them through the dark hours and lead them safely into whatever dawn might bring. In this moment of profound quiet, standing at the window with the night air moving gently around him and the last voices of his men fading into dreams, Napoleon felt the full weight of what it meant to be the one they looked to for guidance. Tomorrow would bring its own demands, its own terrible choices, but tonight there was only this peaceful darkness and the sound of the wind carrying the trust of thousands across the sleeping fields of Belgium. The pressed violets lay between the pages of Josephine's letter like small purple prayers, their color faded to the shade of twilight, but their fragrance still holding the ghost of summer afternoons at Malmaison. Napoleon lifted one with the tip of his finger, marveling at how something so delicate had survived the chaos of campaigns and the weight of correspondence carried across half of Europe. The petal crumbled slightly at his touch, releasing a whisper of scent that transported him instantly to the garden paths where she had walked beside him, her hands stained with earth, her voice soft with the names of flowers he had never bothered to learn until she taught them to him with the patience of a woman who understood that even emperors could be educated in the language of growing things. He spread the letter open on his desk, careful not to disturb the other pressed flowers that had made their home between her words. Rose petals the color of dawn, lavender sprigs still holding their silver-green leaves, tiny forget-me-nots that had been blue once but now resembled fragments of faded sky. Each flower was a marker in time, a moment when she had paused in her writing to press something beautiful between the pages, knowing, perhaps, that he would find them later, that they would speak to him in ways her words alone could not. The tent around him seemed to expand as he arranged the flowers on the wooden surface of his campaign desk, creating patterns that echoed the garden beds at Malmaison. He placed the violets where the morning sun had struck the path near the greenhouse, the rose petals in the position of the climbing roses that had covered the south wall, the lavender where she had planted it in neat rows that released their fragrance when brushed by passing skirts. His fingers moved with surprising delicacy among these remnants of domestic happiness, reconstructing not just the physical layout of the garden, but the emotional geography of a time when his greatest pleasure had been watching her hands work in the soil. The memory came to him with the clarity of candlelight through crystal. Josephine, kneeling beside a bed of newly planted bulbs, her morning dress already marked with earth, her face bright with the particular joy she found in coaxing life from the ground. He had stood watching her from the terrace, still in his uniform from the morning's meetings, feeling the weight of empire settle on his shoulders like a familiar burden. But when she looked up and smiled at him, gesturing for him to join her among the flowers, something in him had shifted. The emperor dissolving into the man who could find wonder in the simple act of pressing seeds into prepared earth. Now, in the close air of the tent, with dawn approaching like a distant threat, he tried to recreate that moment of transformation. He arranged the pressed flowers with the same care she had shown her living garden, each placement deliberate, each small decision weighted with meaning. The violets formed a border along one edge of his makeshift garden, their faded purple creating a boundary between memory and present moment. The rose petals clustered in the center like the heart of something that had once bloomed with impossible beauty, while the lavender created pathways between them, silver-green roads leading from one remembered moment to another. The fragrance that rose from these dried remnants was subtle but persistent, filling the tent with the ghost of summer mornings when the air had been thick with the scent of growing things, and the sound of her laughter had mixed with birdsong and the distant murmur of fountains. He closed his eyes and let the perfume carry him back to those walks they had taken in the early hours before the day's obligations claimed him, when they had moved together through the garden like conspirators sharing secrets that had nothing to do with politics or war. She had taught him the names of things during those walks, her voice patient as she corrected his pronunciation of botanical terms that seemed to have been invented by poets rather than scientists. Digitalis purpurea, she would say, touching the tall spikes of foxglove with fingers that knew the language of leaves and stems. Rosa gallica, she would whisper, cupping a bloom in her palm as if it were something precious beyond measure. He had pretended to listen for the sake of pleasing her, but now he found that the names had taken root in his memory, growing there like seeds planted in fertile ground, waiting for this moment when they would bloom again in the darkness of a tent on the eve of battle. The pressed forget-me-nots were the smallest of the flowers, their tiny faces barely visible among the larger blooms, but they drew his attention with an intensity that surprised him. He lifted one carefully, holding it to the candlelight, seeing in its faded blue petals the color of her eyes on the morning she had first shown him the garden at Malmaison, when everything between them had been possibility and promise, before ambition had carved its deep channels through their shared landscape. He placed the forget-me-not at the center of his arrangement, a small blue heart around which all the other flowers seemed to orbit. The symbolism was not lost on him, this tiny flower whose very name was a plea against the erosion of memory, against the way time and distance could wear away even the most precious moments until they became as insubstantial as dried petals pressed between pages. But here, in the quiet of the tent, with the world holding its breath before battle, the flowers seemed to pulse with renewed life, their faded colors deepening in the candlelight as if drawing strength from his attention. The arrangement grew under his hands like a prayer made visible, each flower finding its place in the miniature landscape he was creating from memory and longing. He worked with the concentration he usually reserved for studying maps or planning campaigns, but this was a different kind of strategy, a reconstruction of happiness rather than victory, an attempt to build something beautiful from the fragments of what had been lost. When he finished, the desk before him had been transformed into a garden of memory, each pressed flower holding its position in a pattern that spoke of order and beauty, of the human capacity to create meaning from the simplest materials. The violets formed their purple border, the roses clustered in passionate abundance, the lavender created its silver pathways, and at the center, the tiny forget-me-not held court like a blue star around which all other beauty revolved. He sat back in his chair and studied his work, feeling something in his chest ease for the first time in months. This was what she had tried to teach him during those morning walks at Malmaison, this understanding that true victory lay not in the conquest of nations, but in the cultivation of moments like these, when the soul found its home in simple beauty and the heart remembered what it meant to be at peace. The tent around him seemed to breathe with the fragrance of the dried flowers, as if the very air had been transformed by their presence. Outside, he could hear the first stirrings of the camp, the distant sound of men beginning to wake to the day that would change everything. But inside, in the circle of candlelight and flower-scented air, time moved differently, measured not by the approach of battle, but by the gentle rhythm of memory and the quiet pulse of a love that had survived even the weight of empire. He reached out and touched one of the rose petals, feeling its papery texture against his fingertip, marveling at how something so fragile had endured when so much that seemed stronger had crumbled into dust. Perhaps this was the real lesson of the garden, he thought, this understanding that beauty persisted not through force, but through the simple act of being cherished, of being held close to the heart, even when the world insisted on forgetting. The candle flickered, sending shadows dancing across his miniature garden, and for a moment the dried flowers seemed to stir with phantom life, as if they remembered what it was to bloom under the sun at Malmaison, to drink morning dew and turn their faces toward the light. In that moment, Napoleon felt himself transported completely, no longer the emperor on the eve of his final battle, but simply a man who had once been loved by a woman who understood that the most profound victories were won not on battlefields, but in the quiet spaces where two hearts could meet among the flowers and find in each other the peace that the world so rarely offered. The letters lay before him like fragments of a life he had almost forgotten how to live. Napoleon's weathered fingers moved across the pages with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics, each sheet of paper a doorway into moments when he had been something other than emperor, something more essential than the sum of his conquests. The candle flame cast its steady glow across Josephine's familiar handwriting, the elegant curves of her letters forming words that had once traveled hundreds of miles to reach him in the field. He lifted the first letter, dated from the spring of 1807, when the cherry trees at Malmaison would have been in bloom. Her words spoke of the garden, of new roses she had planted along the south wall, of how the fountain caught the morning light in ways that reminded her of his eyes when he laughed. Such simple observations, yet they contained more truth about who he was than any proclamation or decree he had ever signed. The paper was soft between his fingers, worn thin from countless readings during long campaigns. He could remember receiving this letter outside Friedland, how he had read it by firelight while his marshals discussed troop movements and supply lines. Even then, surrounded by the machinery of war, these words had transported him instantly to the gravel paths of home, to the woman who saw in him not the emperor, but the man who worried about whether the new gardener understood how to prune the climbing roses. Another letter, this one from his mother, written in her careful Italian script. She told him of Corsica, of how the olive trees were heavy with fruit that autumn, of neighbors who still remembered him as the serious boy who read too many books and dreamed of mainland adventures. Her words carried the weight of unconditional love, the kind that existed before ambition, before glory, before the world knew his name. She worried about his health, reminded him to eat properly, asked if he was getting enough sleep. The concerns of a mother transcended empires. He set that letter aside and reached for another, then another. Each one revealed a different facet of the man he had been when no one was watching, when he could simply be Napoleon rather than Bonaparte, when love was given and received without ceremony or calculation. Josephine's letters spoke of quiet evenings, of books read aloud by the fire, of plans for improving the greenhouse. His mother's letters carried the scent of Corsican herbs and the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings. As he read, something profound began to shift in his understanding. The empire he had built, the battles he had won, the codes he had written, all of it had grown from this foundation of love, from the desire to create something beautiful and lasting for the people who mattered most. Every campaign had been fought with the image of Malmaison in his mind, every victory celebrated with the thought of returning to gardens where Josephine waited, with news of which flowers had bloomed in his absence. The tent around him seemed to expand with memory, its canvas walls becoming permeable to the past. He could smell the lavender sachets Josephine had placed in his traveling chest, could hear the sound of her laughter when he surprised her with rare bulbs brought back from distant campaigns. These letters were proof that love had not been sacrificed to ambition, but had been its secret source, the quiet engine that drove his desire to reshape the world. He thought of all the letters he had written in return, dictated to secretaries in the gray hours before dawn, or scribbled hastily between battles. Had he told her enough about the sunsets over foreign fields that reminded him of her hair? Had he described adequately the way certain pieces of music heard in captured palaces made him think of her hands on the piano at Malmaison? The letters before him suggested he had tried, that even in the midst of remaking Europe, he had found time to notice beauty and share it with those who made beauty possible. A letter from later years, when their marriage had ended but their affection endured. Josephine wrote of improvements to the rose garden, of a new variety she had discovered that bloomed twice in a season. She signed it simply, "Your devoted friend," and in those 3 words he heard all the love that had survived the complications of empire, all the tenderness that politics could never quite extinguish. Even after divorce, even after he had married Marie-Louise for reasons of state, Josephine had continued to tend their garden, to preserve the place where they had been happiest. The candle flame flickered slightly, sending shadows dancing across the tent walls. Outside, the camp had settled into the deepest quiet of night. But here, in this small circle of light, surrounded by these fragments of a life lived fully, Napoleon felt more awake than he had in years. These letters were his true legacy, evidence of a capacity for love that had informed every decision, every dream of what France could become. He understood now that the boy from Corsica, who had dreamed of glory, had never disappeared, had never been buried under the weight of crowns and ceremonies. That boy lived on in every letter, in every moment of tenderness preserved between these pages. The emperor had been built around him, not in place of him. Love had not made him weak. It had made him capable of imagining an empire worth building, a future worth fighting for. There was a particular letter from Josephine that he returned to again and again, written during the Egyptian campaign when months had passed without word from him. In it, she described sitting in the library at Malmaison on a rainy afternoon, watching drops of water race down the tall windows while she waited for news. She wrote of how she had arranged his books exactly as he preferred them, how she had instructed the gardeners to maintain his favorite walking path even though winter had made it unnecessary. The letter revealed not just her love, but her faith that he would return, that their life together would resume, that the careful order they had created would endure whatever chaos the world might bring. Reading those words now, he felt the full weight of that faith, the extraordinary trust she had placed in his ability to navigate the complexities of power while remaining essentially himself. She had understood, perhaps better than he had at the time, that all his grand ambitions were really expressions of a desire to create security for the people and places he loved most. The Egyptian pyramids, the Italian campaigns, the reorganization of European law, all of it had been an elaborate attempt to build walls strong enough to protect the garden where they had been happy. Another memory surfaced as he held a letter describing the installation of new heating pipes in the greenhouse. Josephine had been determined that her tropical plants would survive the harsh Parisian winter, and she wrote with excitement about the technical innovations that would make this possible. He remembered his own fascination with the engineering challenges involved, how he had spent an entire evening sketching improvements to the heating system, calculating the optimal placement of pipes and vents. In that moment, bent over architectural drawings by lamplight, he had felt the same satisfaction that came from planning military campaigns, the pleasure of solving complex problems, of imposing order on chaos, of making the impossible seem inevitable. But there was something more in that memory, something that connected to the deepest sources of his ambition. The greenhouse was not just about preserving exotic plants. It was about creating a space where life could flourish regardless of external conditions. It was about refusing to accept that beauty was fragile, that love was temporary, that the things worth preserving could not be protected through careful planning and relentless effort. In miniature, the greenhouse represented everything he had tried to achieve on the larger stage of European politics, the creation of conditions where what was best in human nature could survive and grow. He gathered the letters carefully, retying the ribbons that held them in neat bundles. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But tonight, he had been reminded of something more essential than victory or defeat. He had loved well, had been loved in return, and had built something beautiful from that foundation. In the end, perhaps that was empire enough. The candle burned lower, its flame steady and calm in the still air of the tent. Outside, the night continued its ancient watch over the sleeping army, but inside this small circle of light, surrounded by these testimonies to love's endurance, Napoleon had found a peace that no battle could disturb. The letters would remain long after the campaigns were forgotten, as evidence that a man who had tried to conquer the world had first learned to tend a garden, to write love letters, to notice the way morning light fell across a woman's face as she planned which flowers to plant in spring. The camp bed creaked softly as Napoleon settled onto its narrow frame, his body finding rest even as his mind remained luminously awake. He folded his hands across his chest and closed his eyes, not seeking sleep, but seeking something deeper, a return to the place where he had been most completely himself. In the darkness behind his eyelids, the gravel paths of Malmaison began to materialize, as real and immediate as the tent that surrounded his physical form. He was walking the main path from the house toward the circular garden, feeling the familiar crunch of small stones beneath his feet. The morning sun warmed his face. It was early May, that perfect moment when spring had fully arrived, but summer had not yet begun its intensity. The air carried the mingled scents of roses and lavender, of fresh earth and growing things, of the particular sweetness that came when dew was beginning to lift from grass and leaves. The fountain in the circular garden played its gentle music, the same sound that had greeted him on countless mornings when he had risen early to walk the grounds before the day's duties claimed him. In this remembered place, time moved differently. He was simultaneously the young general who had first seen the house and fallen in love with its possibilities, and the emperor who had expanded its gardens and filled its rooms with treasures from across Europe, and the man he was now, understanding finally that this was where all his selves converged. He turned toward the rose garden, where Josephine had spent so many hours planning and planting, her hands deep in earth, her face bright with the particular joy that came from nurturing beauty into existence. He could see her there now, kneeling beside a newly planted bush, her gardening gloves stained with soil, her hair escaping from its pins in the way that always made her more beautiful, not less. She looked up as he approached, and her smile contained all the warmth of their shared mornings, all the quiet happiness they had built together in this place. They spoke of ordinary things, which roses were thriving, whether the new gardener understood the proper depth for planting bulbs, how the climbing vines along the south wall were responding to the morning sun. But beneath these simple words lay something profound, the recognition that they had created together a place where beauty could flourish, where the future could be planted and tended with patient hands. He remembered sitting with her on the stone bench near the greenhouse, the one positioned to catch both morning sun and afternoon shade. Her hand rested lightly on his arm as they discussed plans for the coming season, which trees to plant in the far meadow, whether to expand the herb garden, how to create better drainage near the pond. The weight of her touch was exactly right, neither possessive nor distant, simply the natural contact between two people who had learned to share space and silence with equal comfort. The garden held all seasons simultaneously in his memory, spring mornings when everything was possibility and new growth, summer evenings when they dined at the small table under the pergola, candles flickering in glass chimneys, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine. Autumn afternoons when the leaves turned gold and they walked slowly through paths carpeted with fallen beauty, planning what would be different next year, what would remain the same. Even winter appeared in this remembered landscape, the gardens sleeping under snow, the bare branches of fruit trees creating delicate traceries against gray skies, the greenhouse warm and humid with plants that bloomed regardless of season. He had loved the garden in winter almost more than in any other season, loved the way it revealed its essential structure, the careful thought that had gone into each path and planting. In this place of memory, he understood that happiness had not been something to achieve, but something to inhabit. Those mornings at Malmaison, those conversations about roses and drainage and the best location for a new arbor, those had been the moments when he was most fully alive, most completely present. The battles and campaigns and ceremonies had been necessary, but they had been preparation for these moments of perfect contentment. He could feel the texture of Josephine's glove as she pointed toward a section of garden that needed attention, could smell the particular mixture of earth and flowers and morning air that belonged only to Malmaison in spring. Every detail was preserved with crystalline clarity. The sound of bees in the lavender, the way shadows fell across the gravel paths, the exact shade of pink in the roses that climbed the garden wall. The fountain continued its gentle music, and he realized he could hear in its sound all the fountains that had ever played in all the gardens he had known, the formal waters of Versailles, the elaborate displays in captured palaces, the simple wells in village squares where his armies had rested. But this fountain, this simple circle of water falling over stone, contained more beauty than all the others combined, because it was connected to love, to the patient cultivation of beauty for its own sake. There was a particular morning that returned to him now with unusual vividness. A day in late April when he had found Josephine in the conservatory, carefully transplanting seedlings that would eventually bloom in the formal parterre. She worked with complete absorption, her movements precise and gentle, each small plant receiving exactly the attention it required. He had watched her for several minutes before announcing his presence, struck by the way her face reflected a kind of peace he rarely saw elsewhere. Not the social contentment of drawing rooms or the satisfied exhaustion that followed successful entertainments, but something deeper and more essential. When she finally noticed him, she had looked up with dirt-stained fingers and laughing eyes, asking if he thought her foolish to spend so much time on such small things. He had knelt beside her then, taking one of the tiny plants in his own hands, marveling at its delicate root system, its perfect miniature leaves. In that moment, he understood that she was not tending plants, but tending the future itself, creating the conditions in which beauty could unfold according to its own mysterious schedule. The memory expanded to include the entire morning that had followed, how they had walked together through every section of the garden, planning improvements and discussing the peculiar challenges of French soil and climate. She had shown him a corner where she hoped to establish a small orchard, another area where she envisioned a cutting garden that would provide flowers for the house throughout the growing season. Her vision was both practical and poetic, rooted in deep knowledge of what would actually grow, but elevated by an imagination that could see the garden not just as it was, but as it could become. He remembered, too, his own growing excitement as they talked, the way her enthusiasm had awakened in him a corresponding passion for the work of creation rather than conquest. Here was a different kind of campaign, one measured not in miles covered or territories claimed, but in the patient accumulation of small beauties, the gradual transformation of raw land into something that could nourish both body and spirit. The satisfaction was different from military victory, quieter but more lasting, less dramatic, but more deeply rooted in the fundamental human need to make something good from whatever materials the world provided. The tent around his physical form seemed very far away now, less real than this garden where his truest self lived on in eternal spring. Here, all his selves walked the same paths under the same benevolent sky, the boy who had dreamed of glory, the lover who had built a home, the emperor who had tried to reshape the world according to his vision of beauty and order. They were not different people, but different aspects of the same essential self, all united in their capacity for love, for wonder, for the patient tending of growing things. In the garden of memory, morning lasted as long as he needed it to last. Time was not an enemy here, but a friend, allowing him to savor each moment of perfect happiness, each instant when love had made the world exactly what it should be. And in that understanding, surrounded by the eternal spring of Malmaison, he found a peace that no battle could disturb, a happiness that no defeat could diminish. The garden would endure in his memory, perfect and complete, a testament to the possibility that human beings could create something beautiful together, something worth preserving against all the forces that sought to reduce the world to ash and ambition. The canvas flap moved gently in his hand as Napoleon stood at the threshold of his tent, neither fully inside nor completely outside, suspended in the liminal space where night began its slow surrender to day. The eastern horizon held the faintest suggestion of change, not yet light, but no longer the absolute darkness that had cloaked the sleeping army. He had stood in doorways like this before countless battles, but this morning felt different, not charged with anticipation or strategy, but suffused with a profound acceptance of whatever was to come. The camp lay in perfect stillness around him, thousands of men breathing in the synchronized rhythm of deep sleep. Occasionally a horse would shift in its lines, leather creaking softly, or a sentry's footsteps would mark the measured progress of watch duty, but these sounds only emphasized the greater silence, the profound peace that settled over armies in the hours before dawn. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the ancient daily miracle of sunrise. The temperature was perfect, cool enough to be refreshing after the closeness of the tent, warm enough that he felt no desire to retreat indoors. The air carried scents that spoke of the eternal rhythms that continued regardless of human ambition. Dew forming on grass, rivers flowing in their distant channels, earth breathing in the darkness. These were the same scents that had greeted armies throughout history, the same cool air that had touched the faces of Caesar and Alexander and all the other men who had stood on the edge of battles that would reshape their worlds. But standing here now, Napoleon felt no kinship with those ancient conquerors, no sense of participating in their grand tradition of martial glory. Instead, he felt connected to something larger and more peaceful, to the eternal cycle of days and seasons, to the patient endurance of earth and sky, to the great pattern of existence in which human ambitions were simply brief variations on themes as old as time itself. A breath of air stirred the tent ropes, setting them to vibrating with a sound like distant harp strings. The horizon was beginning its slow transformation, black giving way to the deepest blue, the first hint that somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, the sun was beginning its daily journey. He had watched this transformation thousands of times, from the walls of captured cities, from the decks of ships crossing the Mediterranean, from the windows of palaces where he had signed treaties that redrew the maps of Europe. But he understood now that all those dawns had been preparation for this one, this moment of complete stillness when he could witness the daily miracle without the need to act upon it, to use it, to turn it to strategic advantage. This dawn belonged entirely to itself, and he belonged entirely to this moment of witnessing. There was nothing to plan, nothing to achieve, nothing to become that he was not already in this perfect instant of being present to the world's quiet beauty. Somewhere in the darkness, a single bird called, its voice clear and pure in the silence. The sound seemed to come from very far away, from a world untouched by armies and ambitions, where birds sang simply because singing was their nature, because the approaching dawn called forth their music as naturally as flowers open to receive the light. He found himself smiling at the sound, not with the satisfaction of a general who hears favorable omens, but with the simple pleasure of a man who recognizes beauty when it presents itself without agenda or purpose. His breathing had settled into the same deep rhythm as the sleeping camp around him. He was no longer separate from the army, no longer the emperor standing apart from his men, but simply one more human being suspended in this moment between night and day, between past and future, between all the things he had been and whatever he might yet become, the weight of command, the burden of decision, the constant pressure of being Napoleon Bonaparte, all of it had dissolved into this perfect present moment. He thought of all the dawns that had brought victory, all the mornings that had ushered in defeat, and realized that each had been exactly what it needed to be. The victories had taught him what was possible. The defeats had taught him what was necessary. Both had been gifts. Both had been part of the great education that had brought him to this moment of complete understanding. The horizon was definitely lighter now, the stars beginning to fade as the sky slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifted from black to gray. Soon the camp would begin to stir, men would emerge from their tents, horses would be saddled, the great machinery of war would resume its ancient rhythms. But for now, in this suspended moment, there was only this perfect stillness, this complete acceptance of his place in the vast pattern of things. There was something almost musical about the way the dawn approached, a gradual crescendo of light that seemed to follow laws as precise as those governing symphony or sonata. He had always been sensitive to such patterns, had built his military strategies around the recognition that battles, like musical compositions, had their own internal logic, their own inevitable progression from opening movement through development to final resolution. Standing here now, he felt himself to be not the composer of this particular dawn, but simply one instrument in a vast orchestra, contributing his small part to a harmony too large for any single consciousness to comprehend fully. The thought brought him unexpected comfort. All his life he had struggled with the weight of individual responsibility, the burden of being the man upon whom so much depended. Armies had marched at his command. Nations had risen and fallen according to his decisions. The map of Europe had been redrawn by his ambitions. But here, in this moment of perfect suspension between night and day, he felt himself released from that terrible isolation of command. He was part of something larger, subject to the same natural laws that governed the movement of stars and the changing of seasons. A slight shift in the air brought him the scent of distant fields, of crops growing in valleys far from the concerns of armies, of farmers who would rise with this same sun to tend their own small portions of the earth. These men knew nothing of his campaigns, cared nothing for his victories or defeats, yet their patient labor was more essential to the world's continuation than all his grand strategies. They planted and harvested according to rhythms established long before the first empire was dreamed of, and they would continue their work long after the last emperor had been forgotten. The recognition filled him not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of relief. His empire would pass, as all empires passed, but the work of cultivation would continue. Somewhere, in gardens and fields he would never see, people would plant seeds and tend growing things, and find in that work the same satisfaction he had discovered in the gardens of Malmaison. The particular forms of beauty he had tried to create might disappear, but the impulse toward beauty itself was as indestructible as the sunrise he now witnessed. He understood that tomorrow's battle, whatever its outcome, was simply the next movement in a symphony he had been playing his entire life. Every note had been necessary, every theme had contributed to the whole, and now the music was approaching its natural conclusion. There was no tragedy in this understanding, no sense of endings, only the deep satisfaction of a piece of music played with all the skill and passion he possessed. The eastern sky continued its slow brightening, and Napoleon continued his vigil at the threshold, no longer the restless emperor pacing his tent, but a man in perfect harmony with the ancient rhythms that governed all things. In that harmony, he found a peace deeper than victory, more lasting than any crown, more real than any empire he had ever dreamed of building. The dawn would come when it was ready, and he would meet it with the same quiet acceptance with which he now met this perfect moment of suspension between all things. The camp bed received him like an old friend as Napoleon settled onto its edge, his hands folding naturally in his lap, his breathing finding its own deep rhythm without conscious direction. Peaceful exhale. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he had nowhere to be, nothing to accomplish, no urgent matter demanding his immediate attention. Pause, with quiet wonder. The sensation was so unfamiliar that it took him a moment to recognize it for what it was, not emptiness, but fullness, not the absence of purpose, but the presence of something far more essential. Soft morning light. The tent was filled with the gentle golden light of early dawn, filtering through the canvas walls, creating an atmosphere of perfect serenity. Contemplatively, every object seemed to rest in its proper place with a completeness that spoke of things being exactly as they should be. The campaign desk with its neat stacks of papers, the simple washstand with its ceramic bowl, the trunk containing his few personal possessions, all of it arranged not by design, but by the natural settling that comes when a space is truly inhabited rather than merely occupied. Gentle realization. He was not waiting for anything to happen, not planning the next move, not calculating odds or considering alternatives. Pause, softly. His mind, that restless instrument that had reshaped maps and rewritten laws, had finally found its natural resting place in simple presence. Peaceful. The thoughts that came were not urgent or demanding, but gentle, like visitors who arrive without agenda and are content to sit quietly in comfortable silence. Soft breathing. His eyes were open but unfocused, seeing not the tent around him, but something deeper, the essential stillness that had always existed beneath all his activity, all his ambition, all the great movements of history in which he had played his part. Contemplatively, it was as if he had been living on the surface of a deep, calm lake, creating waves with his actions and decisions, and only now had he discovered the profound peace that existed in the depths below. With growing understanding, everything he had done, everything he had been, had led to this moment of complete presence. Pause, gently. The battles had taught him about human courage and frailty. The victories had shown him what was possible when will aligned with circumstance. Soft. The defeats had revealed the limits of individual ambition and the greater patterns that governed the rise and fall of empires. Peaceful. The love he had known and lost had opened his heart to beauty, to the patient cultivation of growing things, to the quiet happiness that existed in ordinary moments shared with extraordinary people. Soft tent sounds. Outside, the camp was beginning its slow awakening. The soft sounds of men stirring, the gentle nicker of horses greeting the morning, the distant clatter of pots as breakfast preparations began. Contemplatively, but these sounds seemed to come from another world, unable to disturb the profound peace that filled this small space. Pause. With quiet joy. He was part of that awakening world and simultaneously separate from it, connected to its rhythms while resting in a stillness that transcended any particular moment or circumstance. Gentle recognition. The boy from Corsica who had dreamed of glory was still here, not buried under years of responsibility, but revealed in his essential nature. Tenderly, the lover who had built gardens with Josephine was present too, along with the emperor who had tried to reshape Europe according to his vision of order and beauty. Soft. They were not different people, but different expressions of the same fundamental capacity for wonder, for love, for the patient work of making the world more beautiful than he had found it. Peaceful breathing. His breathing had become so deep and regular that it seemed to merge with the breathing of the earth itself, with the ancient rhythms that governed the movement of seasons and the circulation of rivers and the slow dance of stars across the sky. Pause. With profound contentment, he understood now that this moment of perfect stillness was not separate from all his years of action, but their natural culmination, the place where all movement eventually came to rest. Soft light shifting. The light in the tent continued its gradual transformation as the sun rose higher, painting new patterns on the canvas walls. But even this change seemed to happen within a larger stillness, like variations on a theme that remained eternally constant. Gentle. Time itself seemed to have found its proper pace, neither rushing towards some urgent destination, nor dragging with the weight of unwanted duration, but flowing with the natural rhythm of a heart at peace. With deep acceptance, there was nothing more to achieve, nothing more to prove, nothing more to become. Pause. Peacefully. The empire he had built would survive or fall according to laws larger than his individual will. The love he had known would continue to exist in the hearts of those who had shared it, regardless of what tomorrow might bring. Soft. The beauty he had helped create in gardens and buildings and legal codes would endure or fade as all human creations must. But the impulse that had created them, the fundamental desire to make the world more beautiful and just, that was eternal. Very soft. He sat in perfect stillness, his hands folded in his lap, his breathing slow and deep, his mind finally free from the need to be anywhere other than exactly where he was. Pause. With complete peace. The tent around him, the army beyond, the approaching battle, the uncertain future, all of it existed within this moment of perfect presence, held and blessed by his complete acceptance of what was. Gentle settling. Even his body seemed to have found its natural resting place, muscles releasing tensions he had carried for so long he had forgotten they were there. Soft breathing. Sleepily. In this stillness, he was more completely Napoleon than he had ever been as emperor, more fully himself than any crown or title could make him. pause peacefully. And in that recognition, he found the ultimate victory, not over enemies or circumstances, but over the restless seeking that had driven him across continents and through decades of ceaseless activity. Final exhale, very softly. The silence in the tent was perfect now, not empty, but full, not waiting, but complete. Gentle light, fading. In that fullness, surrounded by the eternal morning light of acceptance, Napoleon Bonaparte finally came home to himself, whispered sleepily, finding in this moment of perfect stillness all the empire he had ever truly needed. The light had changed again, though Napoleon could not say how long he had been lying here, suspended between the weight of his body against the narrow camp bed and something else, something that seemed to lift him beyond the canvas walls of the tent, beyond the morning that pressed against the fabric with its golden insistence. Soft breath. His eyes remained closed, not from exhaustion now, but from a kind of deliberate surrender, a conscious choice to exist in this space where seeing was no longer necessary because understanding had become something deeper than sight. Gentle wind through canvas. The tent around him seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, expanding and contracting as if it were alive, as if the very air had developed a pulse that matched his own. He could feel his chest rising and falling, each breath drawing in not just the warm morning air, but something more essential, something that tasted of all the mornings he had ever known. There was the salt tang of Corsican dawns from his childhood, when he would wake before his brothers and slip out to watch the sun emerge from the Mediterranean, painting the rocky hills in shades of rose and gold that seemed too beautiful to be real. Distant birdsong. But that child running barefoot through the maquis was not separate from the man lying here now. In this strange suspension of time, Napoleon could feel the boy's wonder still alive in his chest, could feel the young officer's dreams pulsing beneath his ribs, could sense the emperor's ambitions, not as memories, but as living currents in his blood. Peacefully. They were all here, all present, not as a succession of selves, but as a single complete being that had always existed in this moment, that would always exist in this perfect stillness, soft rustling. The canvas above him had taken on an almost transparent quality in the strengthening light, as if the boundary between inside and outside were dissolving. He could sense rather than see the vast encampment spread around his tent, thousands of men beginning to stir, beginning to prepare for what the day would bring. But their movements seemed to happen in a different realm, a realm of action and consequence, that felt suddenly distant from this space of pure being where he found himself suspended. Deep, slow breathing. His breathing had slowed until it seemed to match some deeper rhythm, the rhythm of the earth itself turning through space, the rhythm of seasons cycling through their ancient patterns, the rhythm of all the mornings that had ever been and all the mornings yet to come. Each inhalation brought not just air, but time itself, not just oxygen, but the essence of all the moments that had led to this one. Each exhalation released not just breath, but the weight of history, the burden of empire, the endless calculations of strategy and politics that had filled his mind for so many years. Whispered. In this releasing, he began to understand something that all his victories and defeats had been trying to teach him. The tent around him was not just canvas and rope, but a kind of temple, a sacred space where the eternal could be touched, where the individual self could dissolve into something larger without being lost. The camp bed beneath him was not just wood and fabric, but an altar where the offering was not sacrifice, but surrender, not death, but a kind of birth into a larger understanding. Gentle creaking. Outside, he could sense the sun climbing higher, could feel its warmth beginning to penetrate the canvas more deeply. But the light that filled the tent seemed to come from within as much as from without, as if his own being had become luminous, as if the peace he had found here was radiating outward to touch the very air around him. Soft sigh. This was not the peace of exhaustion or defeat, but the peace of completion, the peace that comes when all the fragments of a life suddenly arrange themselves into a pattern that makes perfect sense. Distant church bells. Somewhere in the distance he could hear the faint sound of church bells, though whether they were real or remembered he could not say. They seemed to be ringing not just for this morning, but for all mornings, not just for this moment, but for the eternal moment that underlies all moments. In their resonance, he could hear the bells of Notre Dame on the day of his coronation, could hear the church bells of his childhood in Ajaccio, could hear bells that had not yet rung but would ring someday, in churches not yet built, for people not yet born. Very softly. The sound seemed to confirm what he was beginning to understand in the depths of his being, that this moment, this simple act of lying peacefully in a tent on a Belgian morning, contained within it all the complexity and beauty and meaning that he had spent his life pursuing through conquest and glory. The empire he had built across Europe was real, but it was no more real than this breath, this heartbeat, this perfect stillness. The battles he had won and lost were significant, but they were no more significant than this moment of pure being, this touch of the eternal that asked nothing of him except that he be present to receive it. Soft wind through trees. His body had become so relaxed that he could barely feel its boundaries. His arms and legs seemed to have dissolved into the warmth of the tent, his torso to have merged with the gentle support of the bed beneath him. But rather than feeling diminished by this dissolution, he felt expanded, as if his consciousness had grown to fill not just the tent, but the entire morning, the entire world spread out under the climbing sun, peacefully. In this expansion, he could feel the presence of all the people who had shaped his life, not as memories, but as living realities. His mother was here, her fierce love still burning in his chest. Josephine was here, her laughter still echoing in his ears. His soldiers were here, their loyalty still warming his heart. Even his enemies were here, their opposition revealed now as another form of love, another way the universe had conspired to bring him to this moment of perfect understanding. Gentle rustling of canvas. The tent itself seemed to have become a kind of cocoon, a sacred space where transformation could occur not through struggle, but through simple acceptance. He could feel himself changing, not into something other than what he was, but into what he had always been beneath all the roles and titles and ambitions. Sleepily, the emperor was dissolving, not into nothing but into everything. Napoleon Bonaparte was fading, not into oblivion, but into the eternal human capacity for peace, for love, for the simple miracle of conscious existence. Doves taking flight. Somewhere outside, he could hear the soft sound of birds taking flight, their wings creating a whispered percussion against the morning air. The sound seemed to carry with it all the flights he had ever witnessed, all the moments when earthbound creatures had suddenly revealed their capacity to transcend their limitations. But he understood now that transcendence was not about rising above the earth, but about sinking so deeply into the present moment that the earth itself became sky, that limitation became infinite possibility. Very softly. His breathing had become so slow and deep that each breath seemed to last an eternity. In the space between inhalation and exhalation, he could sense the pause that exists at the heart of all existence, the stillness from which all movement emerges and to which all movement returns. Pause. This was not the stillness of death, but the stillness of perfect life, life so complete and satisfied that it needed nothing more than its own being to be fulfilled. Candle flame guttering. The light in the tent had reached that perfect quality of full morning, warm and golden and complete. But even as he sensed its beauty, Napoleon understood that he was moving beyond the need for light, beyond the need for any external confirmation of what he was discovering within himself. Fading. The peace he had found here was not dependent on circumstances, not vulnerable to the outcomes of battles or the rise and fall of empires. It was the peace that had always been available, the peace that existed in every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of simple being, eternal silence beginning. As he lay there, suspended between sleep and waking, between time and eternity, between Napoleon and the nameless essence that had always been his truest self, he felt a final understanding settle into his bones like warmth, like love, like the gentlest possible homecoming. Whispers. This moment would last forever, not because time would stop, but because he had finally learned to inhabit the eternal present that exists within every moment, the peace that no battle could destroy, the love that no defeat could diminish. Final exhale. In that understanding, he felt himself settling deeper into the perfect stillness, deeper into the warm embrace of the morning, deeper into the endless gentle mystery of simply being alive in a world that had always been, would always be, exactly as beautiful and complete as this single, eternal breath. Join us for more quiet moments from history, where literary storytelling meets peaceful sleep. Subscribe for stories that honor both the art of narrative and the gift of rest.